The Lord of the Netherlands, Felipe II, the King of Spain, was a strict Roman Catholic ruler who tried to establish absolute rule in the country. He trampled on all the state's constitutions, broke his oaths, and used the cruel Inquisition to exterminate Protestants, who, according to him, were heretics, led astray by the devil. Several states rebelled against his rule. Felipe hadn't set foot in the Low Countries for 15 years, but he sent an army over to punish the rebels and to secure the northernmost part of the vast Spanish Empire. General Fernando Álvarez de Toledo y Pimentel, the Grand Duke of Alba, became the king's governor-general. He established the Council of Troubles to arrest, try, and execute those who were responsible for or sympathetic to the revolt. The de facto leader of the rebellion, Prince Willem of Orange, had fled to Germany, where he gathered armies, declared war on Alba, and invaded the Netherlands. Willem's attempts to liberate the country ultimately all failed. But the unrelenting rebels, who called themselves beggars, seized many cities in the Netherlands in the name of the prince. The rebellion became so widespread that Alba and his son Don Fadrique went on a plunder and massacre tour to end the resistance. Many towns ditched the prince and returned to the king. Eventually, only 2 of the 17 states still held out for Orange, Holland and Zeeland. At this point, the city of Haarlem in Holland was besieged by the royal army, and the city of Middelburg in Zeeland was besieged by the rebel army. Alba's son Don Fadrique had a tough time taking Haarlem, the weakest city of the state of Holland. After he tried and failed to take the town by storm twice, he had decided to starve the citizens into submission. As the siege wore on, disease ran rampant inside the town, and outside the town, in the besiegers' camp, many men died from the cold, lack of food, and disease. Don Fadrique was tired of watching so many of his men dying needlessly. He figured he'd done honorably and could break up the siege. His father told him that if he quit now, he'd no longer consider him his son. If Don Fadrique died during the siege, Alba would take over himself, and if he died, his wife would come down from Spain and take over from him. Don Fadrique stayed. In the spring, the situation got worse for those in Haarlem. The ice of the Haarlemmermeer had melted, and supplies could no longer be delivered because the Amsterdam fleet, still loyal to the king, now patrolled the lake. The prince sent in several large fleets to break through, but other than scaring the crap out of Alba, they ultimately failed each time. Willem desperately wrote everyone he knew to send troops. No one came. By March, starvation was taking its toll on Haarlem, with people eating the weeds and the grass from the graveyard. But they wouldn't hear of surrendering, and kept attacking the Spanish camp from the city, sometimes killing hundreds of royal soldiers in a single sortie. They defiantly placed a banner on the wall with the words, "Haarlem is the graveyard of the Spaniards." The governor-general told the king that in all his 50 years of experience as a soldier, he had never seen a town defended with so much skill and bravery. Alba convinced Felipe to send more troops to continue to fight the place. In May 1573, another one of Willem's fleets was defeated, and it was the beginning of the end. The only way to relieve the town now was over land with an army that didn't exist. The citizens gave up and asked the Spanish for a parley. Don Fadrique was like, "Nah." He let loose the cannons again, and Haarlem's city wall crumbled. But the general didn't order an assault. It wasn't necessary. The citizens couldn't possibly hold out any longer. When July came around, 7 months into the siege, Haarlem threatened they would rip the prince to pieces if he didn't save them. They would never forgive him. Willem told them to hold out for 2 more days. Help was underway. As a last-ditch effort, Orange had pulled together a citizens' brigade. He organized feasts and banquets to inspire as many people he could to join the fight. A lot of people signed up, including a young lawyer named Johan van Oldenbarneveld. Remember him? Willem wasn't sure this was going to work. Thousands of untrained people battling the highly trained royal army of Tercios? But he had no choice, and prepared to march them to Haarlem. But other cities were like, "No! It's cool what you're trying to do. Haarlem was important, but you are way more important." So, Willem stayed behind. Needless to say, the citizens' army didn't make it. It was over. Orange told the town to surrender and secure the best terms possible. He made himself an enemy to a lot of people with this move. Don Fadrique was worried that the desperate citizens would now burn Haarlem to the ground, or launch a kamikaze attack to do as much damage to his men as possible. They were certainly planning to. So, the general made super generous terms for surrender. Citizens would be left unharmed, but the garrison would be killed. This was only fair according to the rules of warfare at the time. They had held out too long and caused the citizens harm. For that, they had to be put to death. A few days later, on July 13, 1573, after a 7-month siege, Haarlem surrendered. It had been utterly starved out. The town paid off the soldiers' right to plunder with 250,000 guilders. Next, Maestro de Campo of the Sicily Tercios, Julian Romero, entered the town and told all the citizens and soldiers to hand in their weapons. They would not be harmed. In return for their obedience, they got some food and some money. Romero said that if any Spanish soldiers misbehaved, they should tell him about it, and he would punish the culprits. As per the terms of surrender, the city's governor Wigbol, the Baron of Ripperda, and his reduced garrison of 2,000 were executed. The Spanish ran out of bullets, and the 5 executioners grew tired from beheading so many people. So, a few hundred rebel soldiers were tied back to back and thrown in the Haarlemmer Lake to drown. Haarlem was now the king's again. But to call its capture a triumph for Felipe would be pushing it. It had taken 30,000 highly trained troops 7 months to conquer the weakest city of Holland, and they had lost 12,000 men. How many more men, how much more time, how much more money, and how many more deaths would it take to reduce the rest of that little state? After the successful but long siege of Haarlem, Don Fadrique marched on Alkmaar. The town's new fortifications were not quite finished yet, and everyone freaked out. After some hesitation, Mayor Floris van Teylingen made a call and opened the Friese Poort to allow the beggar companies in. Just in time, because the Spanish vanguard invaded Alkmaar through the Kennemer Poort. The beggars pushed them out again. The royal soldiers headed out, however. They hadn't gotten paid and went to Amsterdam to ask Alba for their salaries. A month later, Alba took care of the mutiny among the Spanish troops, and Don Fadrique formally laid siege on the city. He invested the place so tightly that not even a bird could leave or enter the town. Don Fadrique had over 16,000 men. Alkmaar only had 800 wild beggars and 1,300 armed citizens. The people knew what would await them if they surrendered the city. Alba had sworn to the king that he would cut the throat of every person in Alkmaar once they took it. The defenders of Alkmaar figured they had sluices and could breach dikes to weaponize the sea. It would destroy the arable land, but it was either the crops or them. Beggar captain Jacob Kabeljauw wrote a letter to the prince's lieutenant general for the northern quarter, Dietrich Sonoy, to flood the area. But someone had to break through the siege line and deliver this message. Carpenter Maarten Pieterszoon van der Meij took the rolled-up letters in his hollowed-out pole and snuck past the Spaniards to deliver the message to Sonoy. In the meantime, the sea beggars captured Geertruidenberg on the other side of Holland. A few weeks into the siege of Alkmaar, Don Fadrique started shooting at the city walls, 12 hours long. They could hear the cannon blasts all the way in Amsterdam. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon the next day, Don Fadrique ordered a storm on opposite ends of the city, because that had worked so well at Haarlem. After some confusion concerning siege bridges, the ferocious Tercios moved as one man, confident of their victory. But they faced citizens and soldiers who were even more fierce and more daring than those at Haarlem. Anyone who could walk stood on the walls and became a soldier, while women and children brought supplies. Not only did they shoot at the attackers with everything they had, but they also threw shards of glass, burning broomsticks and stones at them, and they poured boiling water, pitch, oil, urine, molten lead, and unslaked lime on the attackers. Hundreds of tarred and burning hoops were ring-tossed around the assailants' necks. Alkmaar had their own K now, Trein Rembrandts. She is one obscure lady who only appeared in the stories about the siege a century after the fact. But whatever their names were, they were definitely fierce ladies who helped during both sieges and many sieges beyond. The Spanish had never witnessed such a thing. They had also been baffled at the sight of Dutch women reading books. So that's where they got their heretical ideas. The attack restarted 3 times, each time with fresh troops and more determination. The attacks were repelled 3 times by the even more determined defenders. After 4 hours, night fell, and they sounded the retreat. Nearly 500 Spanish soldiers lay dead in the trenches. Only a few of the defenders had died. Geronimo, a Spaniard, had been taken prisoner. If he spilled the beans on all the Spanish plans, he'd be pardoned. After he told them, the citizens figured they'd execute him anyway. Geronimo pleaded with them to rethink this. He would even go down on his knees with them to worship the devil if that could spare him. And the uber-strict Calvinists were like, "We're doing what now?" They hanged the poor man. 2 days later, the cannons were firing at Alkmaar again. The citizens were well prepared for another assault. As the Spanish stood in battle array, they watched them sink their pontoon bridge before their eyes. Alkmaar men stood on the walls drinking beer and telling the Spanish that if they wanted some, to come get it. Maids stood on the walls in their finest clothes, taunting the soldiers that if they wanted some of this, they should come get it. In the afternoon, after 700 shots, Don Fadrique ordered another assault. But the Spanish said, "You and what army? 'Cause we ain't doing that again." The place was obviously defended by the devil who protected his children. No amounts of pleas or threats could move them. Some soldiers would rather their officers run him through with a sword than go anywhere near that place. Don Fadrique was forced to stand down. In the meantime, Sonoy had gotten Kabeljauw's message from Van der Meij and breached the 2 primary dikes. The north wind carried the water inland. Things started getting a little soggy in the Spanish camp. Van der Meij returned to the town with messages from Prince Willem and Sonoy, but he lost his pole while fighting his way back in. Don Fadrique was handed the pole and its letters. He was impressed. These were pretty determined and desperate people he was dealing with. They were willing to destroy their farmland to wash away the Spanish. He talked to his officers. They agreed that they had done all they could. Losing their men to the ocean instead of battle was dishonorable. On October 8, 1573, Don Fadrique ordered the retreat. It was a big deal. As people said, "Van Alkmaar begint de victorie." From Alkmaar, victory begins. Oh, and our favorite bloodthirsty seigneur, Philippe Lord of Noircarmes, passed away after getting injured during the siege. For months now, he and many other local nobles who'd been committing atrocities in the king's name had been sending letters to Willem. They wanted to apologize and ask for forgiveness for their cruel behavior against their own people. Orange had just let Noircarmes know that he was extremely disappointed in him. A few days after the loss of Alkmaar, the king's stadholder for Holland and Zeeland, Maximilian Hénon Liétard, the Count of Boussu, sailed into the Zuiderzee with a fleet of 30 ships. Rebel Admiral Cornelis Dirkzoon with a fleet of 25 vessels cruised the same waters, hoping for close combat with the Spanish fleet. But Boussu's ships were bigger and their heavy cannons kept the sea-beggar ships at bay. But then, with a strong easterly wind in their backs, the whole Dutch fleet bore straight down on the Spanish. 5 of the king's ships were captured by the beggars right away. The rest of the fleet retreated with the Dutch in close pursuit. Only 1 ship remained. Boussu's the Inquisition, by far the largest and best manned of both fleets. Only 4 smaller beggar ships remained behind to fight him. 1 sank and the other 3 were grappled. During the life-and-death combat that lasted all day and all night, the 4 entangled vessels got stranded on the West Frisian shore. From the beaches, more rebels were rotated in to help take down Boussu and his crew. The stadholder realized resistance was futile and surrendered. He and his 300 men were taken hostage. Boussu was a high-profile prisoner. Everyone figured he would be exchanged for Philips Willem, the Prince of Orange's son, still held in Spain by the king. 2 rebel triumphs in 1 week were an embarrassment for Alba. He needed a victory to save his reputation and the country. He sent Francisco de Valdez and Romero with 4,000 tercios to besiege Leiden, deep in rebel territory. Leiden knew surrender equaled certain death. They would hold out as long as possible. The place was in good shape. The city had great defenses and trenches couldn't be dug in the loose soil. It was well garrisoned with Huguenot, English, and Scottish soldiers, and the town had plenty of food stored. They could afford to wait it out. Valdez realized that a quick win was out of the question. He decided to capture all the wealthy towns in the area instead. He would cut off Leiden's support and starve the place out. He went to Delft and Romero went to Maassluis. Valdez did everything he could think of to get Delft to open their city gates. deception, bribes, assassins, smuggling in 1,000 men on ships with the help of a French spy. All attempts failed, and when Delft's garrison grew to 1,000 men overnight, Odeth gave up. He had already lost 700 men trying to take the town. Romero managed to take Maassluis, where he captured Philips van Marnix, Lord of Sint-Aldegonde, the prince's close friend and confidant. He had been building defensive ramparts when Romero suddenly showed up. A local farmer who had feared his land would be flooded and become useless had shown the Spanish the way. Sint-Aldegonde's troops fled, and he fought till the end, sword in hand, until he had to surrender. The prince swore that if Alba executed Sint-Aldegonde, he would execute Boussu in turn. Both remained unharmed. After Romero's attempt to take Delfshaven failed, the Spanish left the area. Leiden knew they could still count on a relief army. Now Willem officially switched from Roman Catholicism to Calvinism, a better fit according to him. Despite this conversion, he still urged tolerance toward Roman Catholics. Juan de la Cerda, Duke of Medinaceli, Alba's replacement as Governor-General, decided he didn't want the Duke's job after all. He left without even saying goodbye. Felipe had to find someone else. Again. After thousands of executions and many complaints to Felipe's court, the king knew he needed to change tactics. He officially recalled Alba and replaced him with the allegedly much more temperate Don Luis de Requesens y Zúñiga. Requesens wasn't exactly champing at the bit to take the job, but he was at last persuaded by the king. The new Governor-General for the Netherlands had to ensure that the obedient states remained obedient and joined him in his war against the two rebel states Holland and Zeeland, or at the very least help pay for that war. The obedient Dutch were insulted, however. Felipe had sent them a mere gentleman of cloak and sword, and not a royal. Holland mocked them. At least they had a prince as their ruler. Neener, neener. The rebel states also told the loyal states that they could simply refuse to accept Requesens. They had the constitutional right to do that, you know. But everyone accepted the gentleman of cloak and sword. Alba couldn't wait for his replacement to arrive. His reputation was severely damaged because he had failed to get the Dutch under control, and he didn't want to spend another winter in this godforsaken country. His gout was killing him. Requesens arrived in Brussels in November and ordered Alba to immediately hand over the government. The Duke was like, adios. He didn't even take the time to get Requesens up to speed. Alba and his son Don Fadrique did not receive a warm welcome in Spain. Felipe even banished them from the Spanish court as punishment for their outrageously cruel practices, but also because of Don Fadrique's shameful treatment of a young woman he had vowed to marry, but ditched the moment a prettier lady came along. The new Governor-General looked at the state of the country and was like, holy crap on a cracker, what happened here? The military budget was a mess and the whole Spanish army was on the verge of mutiny for not getting paid. No wonder the people hated the King of Spain. His representative Alba had been a monster. The king told Requesens to be milder to the people, but to do God a huge favor and find a way to get rid of the evil Nassau brothers who started this whole mess in the first place. Willem with his League of Nobles and Lodewijk with the Compromise of Nobles. They had to die. Requesens was like, sure, I'll get right on that. But first I'm gonna relieve Middelburg in Zeeland. Middelburg was the last town on the Isle of Walcheren still in the king's hands. It had been under siege by the rebels for over a year. The place was starving. Requesens felt that the commander still holding the town, the most distinguished 70-year-old Colonel Cristobal de Mondragon y Otálora de Mercado, could not be abandoned to his fate. Besides, he was sitting on a ton of money and merchandise. The Governor-General personally went down to Bergen-op-Zoom to instruct the Spanish fleet to supply the town. The Prince of Orange personally went to Flushing to instruct the Dutch fleet to stop them. Now here's the thing. The Spanish fleets were part army and part navy. The Dutch fleets were all navy. Admiral Louis de Boisseau, in charge of the Dutch fleet, was navy. Commander Julian Romero, in charge of the Spanish fleet, was army. Who do you think would win in a naval battle? Boisseau's fleet was drawn up in battle array at Bergen-op-Zoom when Romero's first ships came into view and started firing. Boisseau lost an eye, and many rebel officers and sailors were killed or wounded. But that was all she wrote. Romero's men were no match for the skilled veteran sailors who grappled and boarded the Spanish ships en masse. Any Spaniard who tried to surrender was stabbed and thrown overboard by the merciless Zeelanders. They fought to kill, not to plunder, not even stopping to take the gold chains which many Spaniards wore around their necks. Soon the rebels captured 15 ships and killed 1,200 royalists. Romero had to jump ship and swim ashore where Requesens had been watching the nightmare unfold and said, "I told you I'm army, not navy." The mission to relieve Middelburg was over. Mondragon was abandoned to his fate. When the prince demanded his surrender, the colonel set fire to several houses and swore he'd sooner go down in flames with the entire town than hand himself over to the enemy's mercy. Willem knew he was not kidding. More rebel troops started pouring in to surround Middelburg. Willem sent Mondragon a personal message. "Surrender in 4 days. You can leave with full honors of war and everyone will remain unharmed." As part of the generous deal, Mondragon had to hand over several prisoners like St. Aldewonde, or return a prisoner himself 2 months later. On February 18, 1574, Mondragon reluctantly signed the agreement and surrendered Middelburg. With the Spanish driven from Walcheren, Holland and Zeeland were in control of the entire coast and the Scheldt River. Willem could now focus on Leiden, which had been under siege by the Spanish for 4 months now and still held for him. The Prince of Orange asked his brother Lodewijk to draw the Spanish away from Leiden by attacking Maastricht on the other side of the country. Lodewijk pulled together troops with money he'd gotten from French King Charles IX as an apology for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Ever since that day, King Charles' already fragile mental and physical health had declined. He had violent mood swings, one moment boasting about the extremity of the massacre and wailing that he couldn't stop hearing the screams of the murdered Huguenots the next. He blamed himself. "What bloodshed, what murders, what evil counsel I have followed! Oh my God, forgive me, I am lost, I am lost!" He yelled at his mother. "Who but you is the cause of all this? God's blood, you are the cause of it all!" Catherine responded by declaring that she had a lunatic for a son. Count Lodewijk headed out with the youngest Nassau brother, Count Heinrich von Nassau. Requesens ordered Sancho d'Avila and Bernardino de Mendoza to head out and stop the Nassau clan. 1,000 men deserted Lodewijk in a snowstorm. Then he got stuck on the banks of the frozen Maas River across from Maastricht. The ice was too thick for ships to break and too thin to support the army's weight. Meanwhile, Mendoza and Avila arrived in the city with reinforcements. On March 18th, Mendoza crossed the Maas at night to do a camisado on the rebel camp. The Spanish soldiers surprised the rebels and killed 700. Next, Requesens ordered Gonzalo de Bracamonte to join up with Valdez's forces and go to Maastricht as well. The siege of Leiden was raised. The Nassau brothers' ploy was working. Then Mondragon joined in the fun. Now d'Avila, Mendoza, Bracamonte, Valdez and Mondragon were all converging to stop Lodewijk. Though not outnumbered yet, the Count figured Maastricht was a bust, and he should now cross the river further downstream for Plan B, join up with Willem in Delft. But d'Avila shadowed the Nassau brothers' every move. At the village of Mook, Lodewijk found out that the Spanish commander had constructed a boat bridge and crossed the river with his whole army. D'Avila now stood directly in his path. The Count had to either abandon the expedition or fight and win. Fight it was. Early dawn the next day, on April 14, 1574, both armies were drawn up in battle array on the Mokerheide. The fighting began with the usual skirmishing, but after a few hours of merely poking at each other, Lodewijk got impatient. Valdez was closing in with 5,000 men. Once he arrived, the Count would be outnumbered. Bracamonte was like, "Let's go!" D'Avila was like, "We ain't doing a heilige lei, we're waiting for Valdez." His officers were like, "Bok, bok, 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 bok." And after a paternoster and a Hail Mary, the Spanish charged. The tercios captured the rebel trench and pushed the infantry out. The rebels recovered the trench and now Lodewijk and his cavalry charged. At this first blow, the Spanish vanguard was broken and soldiers fled in all directions. Lodewijk pushed them all the way to the river, where they either swam or drowned. The rebel cavalry withdrew to reload their weapons, but the Spanish lancers and the German black troopers were already on them. It was a fierce, bloody, and confusing battle. The rebel army was routed. Lodewijk was shot in the arm and was bleeding out, but he got his brother Hendrik and his officers to make a final, desperate charge. The Nassau brothers were never seen again. For the longest time, Willem hoped his brothers had been captured and waited for the ransom demands. They never came. Lodewijk and Hendrik were dead. The prince had now lost 3 brothers in this war. The rebels lost nearly 3,000 men, the Spanish 150. But immediately after the victory at Mokerheide, the Spanish troops mutinied. They occupied Antwerp to force the governor-general to pay their salary, which was 3 years overdue. Requesens told Antwerp that if they wanted to get rid of the unruly bunch, they had to fork over 400,000 florins. After a little gentle persuasion, threats, Antwerp paid, and the soldiers got back to work. They immediately came under fire from rebel admiral Louis de Boisseau, who arrived with his fleet to save Antwerp from the Spanish mutineers. He did a lot of damage. The Spanish returned fire, but did little damage. Meanwhile, in France, King Charles' physical condition got much worse, probably tuberculosis. His coughing turned bloody, and he suffered from severe internal bleeding. Charles IX died at Château de Vincennes, May 30th, 1574, aged 23. His younger brother Henri, the Duke of Anjou, wasn't in France. He had recently been elected King of Poland, so their mother Catherine de' Medici once again resumed the regency until King Henri III returned from Poland. His youngest brother, Hercule François de France, then became the Duke of Anjou. Keep this guy in mind. After the mutiny was over, the Spanish were like, "Leiden, we're back." While the siege had been lifted, the prince had advised the town to restock their supplies and take in a larger garrison, but they had said, "Nah, we're good." So when Baldeth returned, they were in bad shape. They had no troops to speak of, no supplies, and after Lodewijk's defeat and death, no chance of a relief. They figured they'd surrender. Orange was like, "I got you, boo, give me 3 months." Requesens quickly released a general pardon, hoping it would draw the people of Leiden away from the prince and back into the loving embrace of the King of Spain. Willem feared that the people might fall for it. They didn't. They were not a conquered people and would rather die than give up their reformed worship. Baldeth did not charge, did not shoot, and no citizens were on the walls defying the Spanish troops. Baldeth was starving the city out, and he was succeeding. Leiden was reaching the starvation point. Orange had decided to relieve the town with a fleet. They would breach the dikes and flood the land. Farmland would be ruined for years to come, so people protested, but Willem prevailed. Better a rotten land than a lost land. In August, the sluices at Schiedam and Rotterdam were opened, the dikes were breached in 16 places, and the sea came rushing in. Willem personally oversaw operations because local farmers threatened to close the breaches again, but with the prince looking right at them, they didn't dare. A young lawyer named Johan van Oldenbarneveld oversaw one of these dike breaches. He was also responsible for the farmers' financial compensation. Once again, keep this guy in mind. He's gonna be crucial later. Spoilers. In Rotterdam, Willem suddenly collapsed. Doctors discovered the prince had contracted the bilious fever and confined him to bed. Everything came to a grinding halt. The Spanish started sending pamphlets into Leiden claiming that Willem had died of the plague. Baldeth also sent in a letter with a deal for the citizens. No one would be harmed if they just surrendered now. All would be forgiven. They should respond within 48 hours. But Leiden also received a letter from the prince's sickbed assuring them that the dikes had been breached. Help was coming. Willem's letter was celebrated with music and cannon blasts. It confused the besiegers. What were they so happy about? But their feet started getting wet. Baldeth was like, "Ah, shucks. They're trying to wash us away. Again." Baldeth talked to all the experts. What do I do now? Locals assured him that breaching the dikes around these here parts was a truly reckless and pointless act. There were so many of them. 3 weeks passed. The citizens were getting desperate. Food was almost gone. The state of Holland assured them they would save the town. With Leiden lost, all Holland must perish. Finally, on September 1st, 1574, Admiral Boisseau arrived from Zeeland with 200 ships and 2,500 sailors. From the first breached levee to Leiden was 15 miles. The rebel fleet moved across the inundated land toward the city, taking Spanish forts and breaching more dikes along the way. So many dikes. With every breach they made to move forward, the water level dropped lower and lower. Then the eastern wind came up to blow the water back to the sea and the whole fleet ran aground. They'd gone 2 miles. If they could make it to the deep canal toward Lake Zoetermeer, they'd be fine. But 3,000 Spanish soldiers defended that canal and the bridge across it. Boisseau was like, I'll take that bet. With the strongest vessels, the heaviest artillery, and his bravest soldiers, he tried to fight his way through, but the Spanish were too well dug in, and after he lost a few men, Boisseau signaled the retreat. In the meantime, Leiden hit starvation levels Haarlem never reached. People were dropping like flies. The watchmen found entire families in their houses, killed by the plague, because that was also raging now. During the run of the siege, of the 18,000 inhabitants, about 7,000 died. Desperate as they were, the people held out. Spanish brutality was more frightening than the plague. Finally, a week later, the wind shifted to the northwest and it stormed for 3 days. The waters rose rapidly and the rebel armada was afloat again. Some local fugitives showed the admiral a shortcut to the canal via a low dike. When the Spanish troops defending the dike saw the fierce sea beggars coming, they fell back. The fleet moved forward, driving the fleeing soldiers back before it. Zoetermeer and Benthuizen were abandoned, and Boisseau set these places on fire. The flames could be seen from Leiden city walls, a beacon of hope. It was a reverse scorched earth policy. Now the Spanish could not regroup and attack the beggars from the rear. Still 4 miles to go. The fleet approached Zoeterwoude, a strongly fortified village. The place was swarming with Spanish troops that had been driven back by the Dutch. 2 more forts lay beyond it, Fort Lommen, commanded by Colonel Borgia, and Fort Leiderdorp, Valdez's headquarters. But damn, another obstacle, the Kerkwegdijk, and the eastern wind was back. They needed about 18 inches of water to float. They had 9. They were stranded again, and stuck for days. The moment Willem had recovered enough to stand, he came aboard the fleet to encourage the impatient men. He checked the area, and before he returned to Delft, the prince ordered the destruction of the final barrier, the Kerkwegdijk. Day after day, Valdez sent the town better and better terms for surrender. He knew something the citizens didn't. He was doomed. Those in Leiden were getting real desperate, but the magistrates and the mayor, Pieter Adriaanszoon van der Werf, were unrelenting. Never surrender. Someone put a dead body at Van der Werf's house, a silent witness to his stubbornness. Others told the mayor off as he walked through the streets. So he headed to the center of the town, took off his hat, and addressed the crowd. Did they really want him to open the gates and let in a fate more horrible than what they now suffered? They would die either way. But starvation was more honorable than to die at the hands of the king's soldiers. He had made an oath to hold the city, and by God he would keep it. Their threats meant nothing. Here is my sword, plunge it into my breast and divide my flesh among you. Take my body to appease your hunger, but expect no surrender as long as I remain alive. The starving crowd applauded the mayor's inspiring words. They climbed the city walls and shouted at the royal army. You call us cat eaters and dog eaters, you bet. But as long as the soldiers could hear cats and dogs, they'd know there was still food. And once the barking and meowing stopped, they would cut off their left arm to eat it, and keep the right one to defend their family, their homes, their liberty, and their faith against a foreign tyrant. If the last hour came, they would burn it all down to the ground and die in the flames together. Valdez was like, damn. The Spanish shouted back, as well can the Prince of Orange pluck the stars from the sky as bring the ocean to the walls of Leiden for your relief. Boisseau was still not moving. Hope springs eternal. The admiral was desperate. He told Orange that if the expected springtide didn't come together with a strong and favorable wind, the expedition should be abandoned. The very next day, storm clouds gathered overhead. And as the storm unleashed its fracking fury, the wind shifted, the tide came up, and the water level rose. Within 24 hours, the fleet was in 2 feet of water. At midnight, the Dutch fleet was once again on the move. They saw Leiden's flag still waving from the towers. The town hadn't surrendered yet. Admiral Boisseau had to capture 3 forts before Leiden could be relieved: Zoeterwoude, Lommen, and Leiderdorp. Any Spanish vessels in the rebels' fleet's path were sunk, and every crew drowned. Whenever they hit the shallows, Zeelanders jumped into the water and pulled the ships forward, ever closer to Leiden. At Fort Zoeterwoude, the Spanish heard the thundering rebel cannons and they saw their escape route across the dike disappearing in the floodwaters. Time to skedaddle. Some got away, some drowned, and many were harpooned, stabbed, or hit with boat hooks by the rebels. Fort Zoeterwoude was captured, dismantled, and set on fire. The most formidable Fort Lommen was next. Most of the rebel troops had retreated here, and the garrison consisted of a bunch of BAMPs. The place was stacked to the rafters with artillery. Boisseau knew the only way to get past it was to either take it by storm or row through the firing line. The admiral decided they should give it their all and storm the place at the earliest dawn. He wrote the prince, "We will tear the fortress to fragments with our teeth and nails before the relief so long expected shall be wrested from us." That night was pitch black, and it made Leiden citizens, the fleet sailors, and the Spanish soldiers very uneasy. Then a loud crash came from the city, spooking the BAMPs at the fort. They were sure the townspeople were coming for them, but the citizens had heard the terrifying roar as well and feared the Spanish were finally coming for them. It was neither. A large chunk of the city wall eroded by the floodwater had collapsed. The massive breach in the wall left Leiden wide open for an attack. It was over. October 3rd, at dawn, Admiral Boisseau prepared for the fight of a lifetime, yet all was eerily quiet. Had the city been taken and were the people massacred? On the top of Fort Lommen stood a boy, waving his cap. Was this some kind of twisted joke? Where were the Spanish? Boisseau soon found out that in the middle of the night, Baldeth had ordered the retreat of all the troops. The Spanish were gone. Leiden had been relieved. Some say that Baldeth's fiancée, Magdalena Moons, had persuaded him not to attack the city for one more night because her family members were inside the town. It's unlikely Baldeth ever intended to storm the city that night, though. The rebel fleet arrived in the city on the morning of October 3rd. Anyone who could still stand lined the docks to welcome their saviors. Immediately, the rebels handed the starving citizens half a loaf of white bread, a piece of cheese, and herring each. Some ate so quickly and so much after having been starved for so long that they died. Every year, Leiden celebrates the 3 October festival when the city hands out free herring and white bread to the citizens of the town. Legend has it that a little orphan boy named Cornelis Joppenzoon found a cooking pot full with hutspot left behind by the BAMPs at the Lommen fort. Hutspot is now a traditional Dutch mash of carrots, onions, and potatoes. Back then, they were probably sweet potatoes. Those from the Americas hadn't quite found their way into European kitchens yet. And, well, the reason the orange carrots are so popular today, instead of the white, purple, and red variety, is because these were the most commonly grown in the Netherlands in the 16th and 17th centuries. Because, you guessed it, the Prince of Orange, or so the myth goes. Willem heard of the relief while attending a church service. After the sermon, he had the message passed on to the reverend who let the congregation know. News traveled fast. Holland erupted in celebrations, and despite not having fully recovered, the prince visited the plague-ridden Leiden the next day. A year later, Willem founded Leiden University, the first university in the rebel Netherlands, in recognition of the city's sacrifice during the siege. He created the Protestant Humanist University in the name of the king, the only one allowed to establish new universities. It was important that Protestant preachers and teachers were educated here. They would turn the Low Countries Calvinist, yet. Of course, King Felipe forbade anyone from attending the school, and it was initially hard to find professors, but the university still stands today, nearly 450 years later. All summer long, Felipe had been stewing in his juices. The king thought he was losing his mind. There were 15 obedient states and 2 rebel states. Felipe had ordered recompense to be milder to the 15, except in religious matters, but he had no clue what to do about those Hollanders and Zeelanders in Las Islas, as he called the 2 states. The Spanish council was of no help to him. And Felipe's chief advisors, the Duke of Feria, Abraham de Espinosa, and Ruy de Gomez, had died. His new advisors failed to advise, and everyone just kept unloading all their fears and problems on him. Not one of them had solutions, but all expected him to take care of everything as though he were God. The king worried that the Netherlands as a whole could soon slip through his fingers. It wasn't for lack of troops. 60,000 men could take any country down, but Felipe had no money to pay them, so his army was always on the verge of mutiny. Sooner or later, his soldiers' brutal behavior would cause the obedient 15 states to join the rebellious 2 in their revolt against the king. Felipe couldn't just give up on these 2 rebel states. His other territories might figure, hey, this rebellion thing works, let's give that a try. It would end the monarchy. Finally, Felipe took the Grand Duke's Alba's advice. The king would punish the depraved rebel states to send a message to everyone else in his realm. No one revolts against the King of Spain and gets away with it. The states had to be utterly destroyed, either by flooding them completely or burning every town to the ground. Flooding was dangerous and cruel, because once the dikes were gone, there was no stopping the water, and farmland would be ruined for a long time. The king couldn't afford to be considered cruel, even if his vassals deserved the punishment. Burning it all down was better. Conquerors did it all the time, and it could be stopped the moment the rebels begged for mercy. Requesens was like, why not both? He started breaching dikes and burning towns. But then his soldiers demanded their salaries. Requesens had no money to pay them and had no time to replace these mutinous troops. On December 11, 1574, his men walked right out of Holland. The beggars grabbed nearly all the abandoned cities. Holland was Spanish-free since 74. King Felipe thought of a different strategy. A fleet should capture Dutch harbor towns, end their rebel trade, and starve the country into submission. The king confiscated 200 vessels and ordered Admiral Pedro Menendez d'Aviles to refurbish them as warships. But it would take years to build a proper armada, and there were no safe harbors in the north that his fleet could retreat to in case of a counterattack. And after spending 500,000 ducats on that Atlantic fleet, it was wiped out by the plague, which even Menendez didn't survive. And heavens to Betsy, the Ottomans were at it again. The Turks under Sultan Selim had sent a massive fleet Felipe's way and snatched up Spanish-held Tunis right from under his nose. Will the nightmares never end? The cities of Holland were complaining. They paid a lot of money for the war, but they'd been hearing rumors that the prince was using tax money on himself. Some even stopped paying. Willem said, I never used public money for anything other than the cause, but I understand the confusion. I should quit. You guys can take it from here. This very suggestion freaked everyone the frack out. The cities begged the prince to stay, promising him more money and more power. Willem was like, aw, you guys. Okay, I'll stay. The Governor-General wasn't doing too hot. Without troops, Requesens was running out of options. He couldn't do battlefields or sieges, and he couldn't flood the land or burn the towns. Requesens also wasn't feeling the love from the loyal states, and the finances were a mess. The war had to end. And the only way to end it was to deal with the one who started it, Willem, the Prince of Orange, who was now taking a victory lap around the de-Spanified Holland. Requesens had been sending both negotiators and assassins Orange's way. The assassins were all caught and executed before they could even get close to the well-guarded prince, and any secret negotiators found Willem, now in the prime of his power, impossible to handle. Secret negotiators were out, and Requesens entered into formal negotiations with all the Netherlands. He got King Felipe to agree, after he had started talking to them. Still, the king ordered Requesens to take a defensive position and steer clear of religious matters. How the man was supposed to get an agreement with those restrictions is anyone's guess. There was a truce, hostages were exchanged, and the conference started March 3, 1575 in Breda. The peace talks dragged on for months. As Requesens had feared, and the rebels expected, it went nowhere. The states had a few demands. All foreign troops had to leave, and the king had to allow Calvinist and Lutheran church services officially. He had to retake the vow to honor the ancient constitutions, rights and privileges of the states. He had to agree to limited powers, and his government should include the States General and the states' assemblies from now on. Felipe had two demands: surrender their Protestant religion and give the king absolute rule. If they agreed to that, he promised the rebels the world. But the beggars were like, no thank you. We don't trust the king. He'll promise forgiveness now, but Felipe will retract it eventually and put people to death for ever having been disloyal to him. We remember the Duchess of Parma signing an accord with the nobles and breaking it. We remember Alba promising to spare towns and then destroying them anyway. And Mondragon still had to release St. Aldegond or turn himself in. Sure, their colonel had released 3 prisoners, but they had died the next day from poison given to them on the day they were set free. And do we need to bring up the assassins? Requesens released St. Aldegond on bail, but only to work on the prince and get him to quit. St. Aldegond tried. He really tried, but Willem wouldn't give up the fight. The king's negotiators warned Orange that if he held on to that religion thing and didn't budge, he would condemn the country to an endless war. There was no way that Felipe could allow anyone in his realm to have a religion different from his own. Willem was steadfast, but even if he had been more flexible, most people of Holland and Zeeland were determined never to surrender their religion and refused the king's absolute rule. They accepted no concessions on these issues. The prince warned the Spanish negotiators that Holland was considering abandoning their sovereign altogether and find a new one elsewhere to protect them. It wouldn't be him. But just so you know, the conference ended in July 1575 and no peace deal was made. In retrospect, the conference was a massive blunder for the king. By agreeing to talk to the rebels, Felipe had recognized them as a legit negotiating partner. Other countries took note and started making trade deals directly with the rebel states. That wasn't the biggest mistake. The Dutch states' representatives had spent so much time cooped up together that they had gotten to know each other really well. In the back rooms, they had even begun to discuss plans to make a joint pact against the Spanish. Oops. Felipe was exhausted. People around the king were getting worried. The 48-year-old couldn't take care of business as fast as he used to. He had no one to relax with, and everyone in his court was confused. Felipe himself said, "I am so tired that I don't know how I could possibly survive." Just a few weeks before the Breda conference ended, 42-year-old Willem of Orange got married again. Wait, wasn't he still married to Anna of Saxony? Yes, he was. But he had found a church court in the Netherlands willing to grant him a divorce, based on shady testimonies. His third wife was a French ex-nun, the 29-year-old Charlotte de Bourbon. Charlotte's strict father had put her in a nunnery against her will. She had escaped from there a devoted Lutheran. Anna of Saxony's family protested the marriage because they didn't consider the divorce legitimate and claimed the prince was now a bigamist. Others felt that a nun, former or not, could not forsake her monasterial vows. The clergy in the Netherlands disagreed with it all and officiated the wedding. The marriage to Charlotte was lovely. Willem loved her dearly and she loved him deeply. And it certainly helped that she was related to some powerful families that could help Willem with the war. With Orange's new marriage, he was no longer required to take care of Anna. Her family bickered about who should take care of her now. The princess demanded better treatment, denying she had ever had an affair and had been pressured by the Nassaus to confess. But she had made up so many contradictory stories of what had happened that no one believed the word she said. Eventually, her uncle August moved Anna to Dresden. They bricked up all the rooms, leaving only one doorway open. But the door was replaced with a locked iron gate. Anna was now imprisoned and slowly going mad. With the peace conference abuzz, Requesens was ready to pounce again and ordered a siege on Buren. The Count of Buren was Philip's Willem, the prince's son and heir, but the king still held him in Spain. Despite Willem's best efforts to preserve the place for his son, the town surrendered 2 days later. It was pretty much left alone out of respect for the Count. Philip's Willem never found out that the Spanish now controlled Buren because he should have gotten more money and he didn't. Next on Requesens' to besiege list was Oudewater, one of the 12 towns that had dared to attend the first meeting of the Free States of Holland. Gilles de Berlaymont, Lord of Hierges, besieged the city. It had a weak but brave garrison, and Oudewater held out for 18 days. On August 7th, Hierges carried the town by assault, burning almost every house in the city to the ground. The royal troops killed the garrison, as well as men, women and children, unless they could buy off their deaths. Some milfs and maids were auctioned off to the soldiers at a few bucks each. Hierges headed for Schoonhoven next. The town feared a bloodbath like Oudewater and started negotiating with the Count. He gave them tolerable terms of surrender 2 weeks later. Hierges sent his brother Lancelot de Berlaymont, the Count of Megen, to Woerden next. The town had already been preparing for a long siege. Megen got nowhere because the town had opened the sluices and flooded the land. The Count then built 7 forts around the city to cut off Woerden from supplies and starve them into surrendering. This didn't work because, miraculously, the citizens were able to catch large fish in the moat to feed themselves. Woerden sent a letter to the prince telling them that they were resisting the siege, but to please send help. The states responded, "Awesome, you're resisting. We're sending help. Soonish." The war in the Netherlands had cost Felipe 22 million ducats since Alba had arrived. That's nearly 4 billion in today's dollars. And the fight in the Mediterranean against the Turks had cost as much. He had money for neither. The expenses of the court, interest on loans, local defense, and the international armies totaled 50 million ducats a year. The king's income was less than 6 million a year, nearly half of which came from the Netherlands. But despite his dire financial situation, Felipe came to the realization that all the money he had already spent on the war in the Netherlands would be wasted if he lost the country now. He decided he should spend a little more. Requesens struggled to get the States General of the Obedient States to give him money for the war. They kept making infuriating demands. Likewise, Felipe was unable to push his new taxes through in Spain because the Cortes demanded stuff in return. The king's financial guy, Juan de Obando, advised Felipe to increase his income from the Americas and do something radical to alleviate his expenses. On September 1st, 1575, Felipe took the drastic measure. He signed an edict that froze the payments on his loans. In other words, he declared bankruptcy. Initially, the bankruptcy wasn't a problem for Requesens. Antwerp bankers were still willing to front him money, believing Spain would come through in the end. The Governor-General was still hoping for a big fleet to come from Spain, despite the last one having been killed off by the plague. But for a fleet to land, he needed a foothold. He should at least recover part of Zeeland. He set his sights on the islands of Schouwen and Duiveland and the harbour town of Zierikzee in particular. Requesens launched a new campaign from Tolen, the only part of Zeeland that was still in Spanish hands after Colonel Mondragon's whaling expedition. They would wait again, but this time through sea beggar-infested waters. Mondragon would follow with a fleet. After a harrowing 6-hour water march during which they came under constant fire and insults, what were they? Seals? The vanguard landed safely on Duiveland. Unfortunately, during a storm that broke out, the pioneers in the middle had gotten separated and stepped off the narrow path. They drowned or were stabbed to death by the beggars. Then the tide was coming in, threatening the royal rearguard. These men turned around and managed to return to shore in time. The Dutch were so freaked out by the sudden and silent arrival of the Spanish vanguard that they fled in all directions. General Charles de Boisot, the brother of Admiral Boisot, was killed by his own men, either accidentally or on purpose. The frogmen took a moment to pray to the Virgin Mary and Santiago, and then got ready to chase the Dutch. Then Mondragon's fleet landed, and he had brought the rearguard with him. The royal troops all teamed up to take Brouwershaven, which they captured immediately. The next town over, Bommenede, resisted for 3 weeks, but Mondragon took the city by storm on October 25th. Massacre and fire destroyed the town, the garrison, and its population. Only 20 people were left alive. Mondragon then besieged Zierikzee, the harbour town where a Spanish fleet could land. He and his men again waded through water and put the 1,500 rebels defending the place on the run, killing most of them right by the city wall. Requesens himself came to Schouwen to give directions for the siege, but the Governor-General wasn't feeling well at all. In February 1576, a lump in the shape of a nail grew on his arm close to his shoulder. He had had them before, so he was like, whatevs, but the lump grew and hardened. A few weeks later, a violent fever seized the Governor-General and he was in absolute agony. Don Luis de Requesens y Zúñiga died unexpectedly on March 5th, 1576, aged 51. The Council of State now took over government, but they implored the king to come to the Netherlands himself or else appoint a new Governor-General immediately, and don't bother sending anyone but royalty. Felipe couldn't leave because of the Ottoman threat, and he could only think of one person who could replace him: Don Juan. A few years ago, Don Juan, leading the Spanish fleet, absolutely destroyed the Turks in the Gulf of Lepanto in a brazen but unauthorized attack. Up until that point, only very few people even knew who this hero of Lepanto was, or that he existed at all. But his stunning victory made him instantly famous. The Pope had even called him the savior of the Christian world. Juan had been raised by Don Luis Mendez de Quijada and his wife. He grew up graceful, agile, and talented in sports, but was destined to become a clergyman. After Emperor Charles died in 1559, Quijada told the now 14-year-old boy they were going to check out the royal hunt. His father sat on a fabulously decorated horse, and Juan sat on a plain one. When Quijada heard the royal trumpets were close, he stopped and told Juan to switch horses. He would understand why in a moment. When they saw Felipe, they dismounted and knelt for the king. Felipe told Juan to stand up. "Do you know who your father is?" "The same as mine," said the king, and he embraced the stunned teen. Juan's father was Emperor Charles V. His mother was Barbara Blomberg, a washerwoman from Regensburg. He was Felipe's illegitimate half-brother. The king himself had only found out about him when the emperor died. The king took Don Juan de Austria back to Valladolid. He got his education with Don Carlos, Felipe's son, and Alessandro Farnese, the Duchess Margarete's son. He would never be a monk. As an officially recognized member of the royal Habsburg family, Felipe had the perfect job for him. He would become the new Governor-General of the Netherlands and prove that he truly was the savior of the Christian world, because it was a mess over there. The king feared his brother would make insane demands, so he ordered the 31-year-old to head for Brussels right away, without troops or advisors. He would receive instructions there. Despite Regensen's death, Mondragon continued the siege of Zierikzee in Zeeland. Orange put Admiral Boisot in charge of an expedition to supply the town by sea. Mondragon had thrown all sorts of junk in the harbor to stop anyone from entering. Boisot's ship, the Red Lion, got tangled up in the mess and couldn't break free. When the Red Lion came under fire and capsized, Boisot and his crew jumped ship. Some managed to get to safety. The admiral clung to a broken mast and swam a long time, but when night came, Louis de Boisot, the reliever of Leiden, died. Zierikzee was doomed. Willem told the town to accept honorable terms. Mondragon, realizing his men were on the verge of a mutiny, was all too happy to give it to them. Right after the siege of Zierikzee ended, a mutiny did break out. Furious soldiers gathered at Mondragon's house to demand payment. The 72-year-old commander came outside, ripped open his shirt, and told them they should cut out his heart if they believed he had betrayed them. FYI, he hadn't been paid for his services either. Then 3,000 mutineers moved on Brussels to demand their salaries from the Council of State. They ended up sacking Aalst instead, occupied it, and held it for ransom. This obedient town was livid. Their loyalty to the king was repaid thus. Woerden was in the 9th month of her siege when the Spanish brought the heavy guns in position. They were revving up to storm the town. The royal forces attacked the fort where the townspeople kept cows, but the citizens fought back so hard that 150 Spanish died in the attack. Only 3 defenders lost their lives. The Spanish had captured 6 cows. That's a lot of hamburgers. So, win? Megen threatened that the town would suffer the same fate as Oudewater, but if they returned to the Roman Catholic faith, all would be forgiven. The citizens were like... There were now 14,000 royal soldiers involved in the siege. The states urged that Woerden should be relieved. They took a month to come up with a plan. They were going to breach the IJsseldijk at some point. Those in Woerden were like, no need to hurry guys, we'll be here all week. Month. Year. The Council of State begged King Felipe to pay his damned troops. But he could do no such thing. His bankruptcy had been a disaster. He had no credit and no cash, and Spanish trade had come to a standstill because the merchants had no credit and no cash. Felipe's servants were mentally broken and prepared to die of hunger, and the Netherlands was in a meltdown. After the Zierikzee mutineers occupied Aalst, Spanish soldiers all over the obedient states joined in. As per usual, the mutineers imprisoned their officers and elected an Aledo, the mutiny commander. They demanded that the Council of State pay their salaries. When they couldn't, the soldiers decided that since the Netherlands belonged to the king, the Netherlands should pay the king's debt. They would plunder all the cities until they were satisfied. In Brussels, the citizens took up arms. They eyed every Spaniard in town with so much suspicion and disgust that the Spanish were afraid to leave their houses. The people no longer believed that the Council of State could protect them. Possibly at Orange's instigation, the citizens arrested the council members, Viglius and the Count of Berlaymont, the 2 remaining consulta members, among them. The men were released soon, but the Council of State had now lost all authority. The Spanish insurrection continued to spread, and even some Germans joined in the fun. The citadels of Antwerp, Valenciennes, Ghent, Utrecht, Culemborg, Vianen and Aalst were in the hands of 6,000 tercios. They treated every Dutch person as an enemy and devastated the countryside and cities. Every day it got worse. Except for those in the town of Woerden, who had been besieged for nearly a year. They saw the Spanish suddenly break up camp and leaving. The soldiers had been ordered south to deal with the mutineers, who made up about 10% of the Royal Army. All over the country, thousands of students, peasants, and curious city folk gathered to fight the Spanish. But at Wissenaken, the volunteers were mercilessly cut down by the non-mutineer royal soldiers. The latter wasted no time in destroying the surrounding towns and its people. The destruction was so absolute in the Wissenaken area that the citizens couldn't return for 10 years. Now no one trusted the Spanish anymore, whether they mutinied or not, and towns in the south decided to kick out the royal garrisons, declaring them all outlaws. The Flemish besieged the Ghent citadel occupied by the mutineers. They asked for Orange's help, who sent over Colonel Olivier van den Teympel and his men. Almost immediately, the Flemish regretted it. They didn't want to be associated with a rebel, but Willem was like, too bad, Van den Teympel was already there. Mondragon's wife was trapped inside the citadel, but the colonel couldn't persuade the mutineers to help him free her. What part of mutinying don't you understand, sir? At the same time, the citizens of Maastricht figured they'd ditch their royal garrison. Together with the German garrison, they drove them from the city. The tercios weren't gonna let this stand. No sirree. Holding women as shields in front of them, the Spanish advanced on the armed citizens standing at the gate. Unwilling to shoot innocent women, the defenders had no choice but to surrender. The town was taken back, and the pillage, plunder, and outrage began. And massacre, of course. The stabbing, drowning, and burning in Maastricht was absolutely horrendous. Don Juan unexpectedly showed up at Felipe's court in Madrid. The king had thought his brother was halfway to the Netherlands by now. Don Juan wanted to talk things through, and as Felipe feared he would, his half-brother had some pretty steep demands. Don Juan wanted money, of course, but the ambitious Habsburger had big plans. He needed his brother to agree to the enterprise of England. Roman Catholic, Irish, and English exiles under Thomas Stukely conspired to invade England and remove the Protestant Queen Elizabeth from the throne. Felipe was like, "You and what army?" "Oh, mine." He seriously doubted the viability of the plan. Still, the king promised his brother that if he got the Netherlands to accept a peace treaty, Don Juan was welcome to take the Spanish troops stationed there, invade England, free Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, marry her, snatch the crown from Elizabeth's heretical head, and declare himself King of England. As you may remember, the Queen of England had imprisoned the Queen of Scotland because her husband had died under mysterious circumstances, and she was a suspect. Also, Elizabeth feared the Roman Catholic woman might claim her Protestant throne. More about that in part 2 of this series. Getting money together for Don Juan's Governor General's salary was tough. Felipe still had no credit since declaring Spain bankrupt. The king did some serious wheeling and dealing and was finally able to satisfy his blackmailing brother. He sent him on his way to make peace with the Low Countries at virtually any cost. Don Juan would receive his final orders in the Netherlands. But the orders Felipe sent changed the plans mercilessly. No one blackmails the King of Spain. The obedient Dutch really couldn't wait for the new Governor General to arrive and sort everyone out. The fastest way for Don Juan to get to the Low Countries was to travel through France. The Spanish royal couldn't just walk into France. He had to be disguised as a Moorish servant. Blackface, hair paint, costume, the works. In Paris, the prince attended a ball at the Louvre in a different disguise. There, Don Juan met the gorgeous Queen Marguerite, the unhappy wife of King Henri of Navarre and sister to King Henri III of France. He liked her. A lot. He also talked to Henri de Lorraine, the Duke of Guise, the leader of the Catholic League in France, and discussed his plans of liberating and marrying Guise's kinswoman, Mary, Queen of Scots. Don Juan arrived in Luxembourg just 2 weeks after he left Spain to discover the Spanish army of 60,000 was reduced to 11,000. Meanwhile, the Antwerp citadel commander Sancho d'Avila had a brilliant idea and told the mutineers from Aalst, Breda, Lier and Maastricht, "Gather round, kids. We're gonna have some fun." The people of Antwerp were getting nervous. They feared the royal army's mutineers would come for them next. The cultural, economic and financial center of the Low Countries could pay the mutineers their salaries 10 times over. Antwerp citadel commander d'Avila worked on the German mercenaries in the town. Colonel Van Ende eagerly signed on, and a drunk Count of Eberstein also signed a document in support of the coming attack. Once he sobered up, Eberstein realized what he had done and warned the governor of Antwerp, Frédéric Perrenot, Lord of Champagny, the brother of Cardinal Granvelle, of what was coming. Champagny was a sincere Catholic, but he hated the Spanish. Eberstein promised him his soldiers would not join the attack. On November 3rd, the day Don Juan arrived in Luxembourg, the governor of Antwerp allowed 6,000 notoriously untrustworthy Walloon troops into the city to help defend the town. But they had no miners or engineers in Antwerp to put up bulwarks. The citizens had to build their own defenses. They did. Men and women improvised defensive ramparts and dug ditches in the streets. The walls were fortified with bales of merchandise, boxes of earth, upturned wagons and other big objects. But they didn't have enough cannons. On November 4th, 1576, a thick fog hung over the city. The citizens could hear a thunderous noise coming closer. At 10 a.m., lookouts on the walls saw a forest moving toward them through the haze. They were the 3,000 mutineers from Aalst, wearing green branches on their helmets who had marched 24 miles since 3 o'clock in the morning. D'Avila welcomed them at the citadel with open arms. He ordered food and drinks for them, but they only wanted some wine. They would dine in paradise or sup in Antwerp. An hour later, the mutineers charged. The improvised defenses were no match for the battle-hardened Tercios. Van Ende and his Germans now switched sides and charged the citizens. Eberstein's Germans were brave and faithful, resisting to the last, and every man died in his harness. The Germans fought well, died well, but the Walloons ran, chased by the ferocious Spaniards. Champagny stormed among them to try to rally the broken ranks. It was in vain. The governor now called on all citizens to defend the town. Men and women came out in droves to defend their hearth and homes, but they could not make a stand against a compact, disciplined and fierce troops. The battle raged through every street and narrow lane. The cavalry moved fast, swiping everyone in their path. Bodies were dropping like flies. Champagny managed to escape to the fleet of the Prince of Orange in the river. During his escape, Eberstein tried to jump into a boat, missed his footing, and he drowned by the weight of his armor. Let the pillage, plunder, and outrage commence. But first, massacre. Citizens tried to flee the city, but the gates were closed or occupied by the Spanish. There was no escape. People now barricaded themselves in their homes. They were difficult to storm, but the royal troops set fire to them. They had brought torches and kindling for this very purpose. The fire spread fast. House after house, street after street was instantly consumed. Nearly 1,000 buildings burned to the ground, and inside them many people died in the flames. But the soldiers were in Antwerp for gold and treasure, and unleashed hell to get it. For 3 long days and 3 even longer nights, the townspeople were subjected to the most unimaginable horrors. The stores were raided first, and then the private homes. Anyone who was suspected of hiding anything was extensively tortured to give it up. If they truly had nothing, they were severely punished for being poor. Foreign merchants, who were supposed to be under the express protection of the Spanish monarch, were plundered, tortured, and killed all the same. Of all the crap the Spanish had pulled so far in the Netherlands, this was the worst. 3,000 dead bodies were discovered in the streets, as many drowned in the Scheldt River, and again that many were burnt or killed in other ways. At most, 200 Spanish were killed. Millions of dollars worth of property was destroyed by the fire. Millions of dollars were taken by the Spaniards, who were now paid their salaries many times over. Some lost it in gambling. Others used it to get golden sword hilts, scabbards, or even whole suits of armor, which they then painted black to make it look like iron. But the blacksmiths cleverly mixed the gold and recovered a lot of stolen loot this way. Now, people of all 17 states were hella mad that their lord had let this happen. King Felipe hit rock bottom, but apparently rock bottom had a basement because the king's worst nightmare came true. All 17 states banded together and made a pact against the Spaniards.